Hi, my name is Zeb Tortorici, and I'm a professor of Spanish and Portuguese at New York University and a historian of colonial Latin America by training. I just want to first say thank you so much for the curators for the very kind invitation to participate in Eros Rising. I'm extremely excited about this exhibition and look forward to seeing it in person in a couple of weeks when I'm back in New York. So what I want to do today is really give a discussion about the intersections of the erotic, the obscene, and the pornographic in a sort of cross-temporal sense, bringing us from the colonial period up to the mid-20th century and into the present through archival praxis, activities around the conservation and preservation of historical and vintage erotica. I'm interested in thinking about this exhibition in terms of some of the longer historical genealogies that the obscene, the pornographic, and the erotic have attained and accrued over time. What I seek to do is trace some of these cross-temporal connections from the late colonial period up to the present, thinking particularly about how colonialism, and the sort of differential power relations of the colonial era sanctioned, promoted, and established particular types and modes of morality. We see this, for instance, in the criminalization of a whole range of sexual crimes and acts, pointing to crimes such as estupro, or what we today would term rape, sodomy, bestiality, masturbation, abortion, infanticide, and a whole range of other topics. So I'll, as we sort of move forward in this presentation, I'll give a sense of how some of the criminalization of these crimes in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries connect to the types of morality that come to be espoused by the states, by Latin American states. And my talk really here focuses largely on Mexico. So the title of my presentation is Archiving the Obscene, Collecting, Preserving, and Destroying Erotica in Mexico. And before I begin, I just want to give a very brief genealogy of the obscene. The word obsceno makes its way into mid-18th century dictionaries of the Castilian language. And one of the earliest entries for the word comes from the Diccionario de Autoridades, volume 5 from 1737, in which obscene is defined as that which is impure, dirty, sordid, and ugly. And the dictionary entry tells us that it comes from the Latin term obscenus. Volume 6 from 1739 defines the word torpe, which we might translate as sordid, as dishonest, shameless, and lascivious. Also connected, conceptually to obscenus, the Latin term for obscene. And what's so interesting here are the ways in which obscenity is sort of connected to notions of pollution, impurity, and contagion. And I'm also really interested in sort of the circular logic that is at operation behind these types of charges, that such and such act is obscene, and this act, though it might be similar, is not obscene, or this person performing a particular act is viewed or perceived as obscene, whereas this individual performing the same act may be viewed through a different lens. And I'll talk a little bit about this as we move forward. So I just want to keep these definitions of the obscene in the background, because I think these connections and the sort of, conceptual impulses behind marking out what gets labeled as obscene and what does not connect very much to how notions and concepts of the pornographic and the erotic develop historically into the present. So what I'll do in this talk is I want to focus on this key moment in 1955 Mexico City, go back to the colonial period and thinking through some of the connections, and then end speaking about a grassroots and community-based archival initiative in Mexico City called Archivo El Insulto. So with this, I begin. In downtown Mexico City, at 10 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, March 26, 1955, a group of conservative Catholic students and professors, hailing primarily from the middle and upper classes, assembled in Mexico City's Plaza de Santo Domingo. This group, largely of men, collectively marched toward the city's main plaza, the Zócalo. And I'll put this image up here just to give a sort of sense of the geographic sense of what I'm speaking about. So the group of anti-pornography protesters begin their march in the Plaza de Santo Domingo here and march southward into the Zócalo, or the main plaza of Mexico City. So this group collectively marches toward the Zócalo with flyers and banners in hand, vehemently protesting what they saw as the immorality of the times. The group demanded, among other things, that those responsible for the massive upsurge in pornography in Mexico, in cinema, theaters, popular print, like magazines and comic books, be censored and punished. The group rallied around slogans like La familia exige respetos, the family demands respect, and Salvemos a la niñez, we must save childhood. As this group arrived in downtown Mexico City, as the group arrived in the Zócalo, Mexico City's massive central plaza that is home to the Metropolitan Cathedral and the governmental buildings, including the Palacio Nacional, they staged a public and almost ritualistic burning of some 3,000 pornographic magazines, many of which, according to contemporary newspaper sources, had been looted or purchased by student groups from city kiosks and barbershops in the previous days. The March 26th, 1955 burning was the result of, as Mexican scholar Armando Bartra has shown, of a convergence of the reinvigorated campaigns against immorality and censorship, reinvigorated campaigns against immorality and the growing censorship efforts on the part of federal and local governments, the Catholic Church, and specifically the Archbishop of Mexico, the Secretaría de Educación Pública, the Comisión Calificadora de Publicaciones, and local organizations and student groups and other activist organizations, including the Damas Católicas. And what I'm interested in here and thinking about is sort of this rallying cry in the words of one of the bonfire's organizers. This individual stated, and this is a quote documented in newspaper sources, that, quote, "The campaign against pornography should not end here, i.e. with this burning. It should be made permanent," end quote. And this call for the permanent eradication of pornography was very much premised in this instance on the physical destruction of material objects, largely softcore men's magazines and revistas artísticas, or artistic magazines geared largely toward male audiences and readers, such as Bella and Vodevil, that tended to print semi-nude photographs of women alongside political articles, satire, advertisements, fiction. And these sorts of softcore men's magazines were burned publicly in 1955 alongside, sexually suggestive comic books and other more explicit, hardcore, and illegally produced erotic novels and novelettes that were laden with hardcore pornographic chromolithographs and photographs. And we'll be seeing a couple of examples of these toward the end of my talk. That this destruction through fire happen, in the centro, in the downtown region or zone of Mexico City, points to the symbolic yet very real role that the ritualistic act of burning played in the historical annihilation and erasure of those things, objects, representations, and even persons deemed not only disposable and dangerous and polluting in terms of gender and sexual desire, but also viewed as somehow detrimental to the societal structures and institutions such as the family, the church, and sort of mainstream gender roles. And it's to this question of cross-temporal, contagious, and polluting ideas around the sexual desire, the body, and the erotic that I now turn. So I've opted to sort of begin this presentation in 1955, and I'm going to stop reading the paper in a sec. I really kind of want to talk us and walk us through a lot of these images that I have to share. But I begin with this 1955 burning because I think it speaks crucially to the interconnected impulses and desires to share, display, and preserve, and even destroy erotica that sort of lurk behind all practices of collecting pornography, erotica, and other obscene things that this paper and my larger projects explore. Such practices, as I gestured at the very beginning, can be traced individually and communally, popularly and institutionally, and across a whole diverse range of historical subjects and archives. Throughout this paper and the larger projects to which it is connected, I invoke the notion of erotic archival imaginaries to point to the oft conflicting ways that explicitly erotic objects and images, deemed pornographic or obscene by some, can come to be constituted through acts of historical and archival imagining, always by and through mediated forms of material presence and material absence. And I really love this photograph, and I'll switch slides here in a second, but I love this photograph because it gives us a good sense of, the deeply gendered nature of anti-pornography activism in Mexico in the mid-20th century, but it also shows us a sort of publicly displayed a performance of morality, a performance that may, for certain individuals, photographed even here in this image, may have been at odds with the ways that they privately put use to pornography and other erotic images. And I think this image is also deeply compelling analytically because it gestures toward the destruction and the sort of, oft conflicting, but sometimes symbiotic impulses to preserve and to destroy, to document and to collect and to eradicate. So given that so many of the historical imaginaries around pornography come to be structured by censorship, destruction, and absence, my notion of erotic archival imaginaries builds on archival studies scholars Anne Gilliland and Michelle Caswell's notion of impossible archival imaginaries, which they define as those records that, quote, for as long as they remain either inaccessible or their contents or their very existence remain speculative, the records, as imagined or anticipated, can inspire all sorts of narratives, suppositions, aspirations, longings, fears, and distrust, end quote. And I think that this quote around impossible archival imaginaries maps beautifully on to this notion of erotic archival imaginaries, in that the material objects and the visual representations similarly produce a whole range of anxieties, longings, fears, distrust, and desires. And we can really think sort of cross-temporally about the ways in which bodies and desires and erotics are imagined both within the records themselves, but also around the ways in which these records circulates, ending up sometimes in the trash, other times in historical archives, sometimes in flea markets and private collections and bookstores, and other times burned or destroyed in public rituals such as this. How then might erotic archival imaginaries, and I think aesthetic imaginaries connecting us to the exhibit at ISLAA, which draw our attention to both questions of memory and materiality, how can these imaginaries be set in motion by particular performances of collecting, preserving, and destroying historical erotica and pornography? How might scholars, artists, activists, and archivists engage with these historical erotic imaginaries to produce new archival, aesthetic, and political practice around the records and their circulations? And here I'm really thinking about the ways in which the records that I'm speaking about today connect us, I think, meaningfully to the types of arts that is being presented and displayed at Eros Rising, and really thinking again about these cross-temporal connections. All right. So this presentation also, I think, offers a really good entry point into my current research project, which is titled "Archiving the Obscene: Censorship and Erotica in Mexico from 1755 to 19." Excuse me. Redo that. Archiving the Obscene: Censorship and Erotica in Latin America from 1700 to 1955. And this is a project that focuses largely on the neglected production, distribution, circulation, and archiving of censored objects, texts, images, and films in Latin America from the early 18th century to the mid-20th century. This long-term project is twofold and will culminate in a traditional scholarly monograph, as well as in the creation of a digital archive that has become a necessary precondition for the research itself. This project, which is being supported by a Mellon Foundation New Directions Fellowship, will, I hope, be the first of its kind to trace the unstable and constantly shifting ideas around obscenity in Latin American history. It too will be the first to digitally archive, in collaboration with the community-based archives in Mexico City, Archivo El Insulto, a growing corpus of Latin American erotic print, photographic, and moving image records that relate to histories of sexuality for the benefit of researchers, students, activists, and archivists. And here I think it's worth noting, again, because my goal is to sort of paint a cross-temporal picture here, it's really worth noting how this current research of mine on erotica, pornography, and the obscene is both connected to, yet diverges from, some of my earlier work on the so-called sins against nature, or the pecados contra natura, of sodomy, bestiality, and masturbation as they were prosecuted throughout colonial New Spain, or the Viceroyalty of Nueva España, from the 1530s up into the early 1820s. And to give a sort of sense of this project and the ways in which my own interests in the erotic and the obscene in the 20th century are fundamentally connected to the 18th, sort of 17th to 18th century colonial pasts, I sort of want to walk us very briefly through three cases from the colonial period, which first drew my attention to the terminology of the obscene, the obsceno, or obscenidad. And I'll just give three quick, quick dives into a couple of cases. So the three cases I discuss now are three of the 327 trials that I look at in my 2018 book, Sins Against Nature. One of those cases, well, let me just say, the book started out as a project that was looking at the criminalization of sodomy and quote unquote homosexuality in colonial Mexico. I quickly realized, conducting the research, that you can't type the word homosexualidad into a colonial archive finding aid and expect to find results. Instead, you look for terms like pecado nefando, nefarious sin, or pecado contra natura, or sodomia, sodomy. But when I typed these terms into finding aids and catalogs, often what I would find were cases that dealt with topics that were not of a priori interest to me. I found hundreds of trials of dealing with the crime of bestiality, which I was somewhat expecting, but I also found cases like the three I share now. One of those is a quote, and I'll just sort of translate the language here, but it's a denunciation que hizo contra sí Juan Esteban Pérez, español, por estar pensando en la Virgen Santísima Nuestra Señora en actos obscenos. Or a denunciation that Juan Esteban Pérez, a Spaniard, made against himself for having been caught, or for having thought about the holiest Virgin Mary, our Mother, in obscene acts. And this is a phenomenal Inquisition record that begins when Juan Esteban Pérez denounces himself, or in the context of confession initially, to a priest for having engaged in sexual acts with the Virgin Mary. Esteban Pérez goes on to describe in explicit detail how he had sex with the Virgin Mary and how he would imagine, how he would imagine her body parts and her partes naturales as representing the Holy Trinity of the Catholic Church. And this case is really fascinating, but it's one of a few dozen that really point to the connections of erotics, religious devotion, and colonial expansion in and around colonial Mexico. So I don't have time to get into really the details of these three cases, but I will sort of, lead you to the Sins Against Nature project that I looked at. But Juan Esteban Pérez was not executed by the Inquisition, was not punished harshly, because he sort of represented or demonstrated repent for his acts and genuine contrition. He was treated leniently by the Catholic Church and simply told not to do similar acts. And he was, I believe, basically mandated to pray regularly the rosary, and was sort of there's a term I'm looking for. He was like recogido in a church or a monastery for a certain period of time to sort of set him straight. The second case that I want to look at very briefly is against Manuel Arroyo por haber aconsejado que no es pecado chupar semen a los hombres. Por haber aconsejado que no es pecado chupar a los hombres el semen humano. And again, this is an Inquisition trial against Manuel Arroyo for having counseled that it is not a sin to suck human semen from other men. And what's interesting with this case is that, as with the acts of Juan Esteban Perez that get labeled as obscene by inquisitors and by the Catholic Church, similarly, Manuel Arroyo, sodomy itself, or the act of sex between two women or two men, is largely not referred to in the records I looked at for this book project as obscene, but rather other slightly more indecipherable, unclassifiable, and perhaps even queer acts and desires, such as having sex with the Virgin Mary, counseling that sucking semen from other men is not a sin, and similar things get sort of wrapped up and become of interest to the Inquisition. And they come to be labeled as obscene, not simply because they're sort of partly unclassifiable, but also because there is oftentimes a sort of colonial class and racial and gendered status associated with these. So the fact that Manuel Arroyo is a mulatto, a racially mixed Black individual, who and not a Spaniard, sort of relates to the ways in which this act is seen as more obscene than, say, had it taken place between two Spaniards or a Catholic priest and a Spanish adolescent. So this case in which Manuel de Arroyo is, engaging in sexual acts with a whole range of individuals and counseling them and telling them that it is not a sin to suck semen, gives us a sense of how and why the Inquisition views this act as particularly obscene. And the third example that I want to draw from here, from the colonial period, is the case of an individual known or named Juana Aguilar, an individual that we today might term intersex, who appears to have embodied her identity as a female, but who was denounced as an hermaphrodita or a hermaphrodite in the course of their everyday life experiences. But what's interesting in this case is that the trials of Juana Aguilar and the criminal trials and the medical assessments and reports of Juana, of their body, get sort of publicly circulated through print culture in a newspaper, a late colonial newspaper titled the Gaceta de Guatemala. And let me be clear that the medical report itself is not obscene, but it is perceived by certain individuals and readers as being obscene. And again, the obscenity, I argue, is not because it simply relates explicitly a particular medic or cirujano surgeon's readings of Juana Aguilar's body, but rather because Juana Aguilar is intersex, because their desires are somewhat unclassifiable, and because Juana themselves is a racially mixed indigenous subject who is marked in terms of class, in terms of their own geographic mobility in Guatemala, El Salvador, and other parts of Central America. And this, I think, is partly what renders, in the eyes of readers, this report that gets circulated in the Gaceta as obscene. And I'll move from here on to, the grassroots archival projects in a second, but I just want to focus, I just want to connect the ways in which obscenity gets produced and constructed in these three cases, I think connects very much to the types, to the ways in which the obscene in the 20th century and the 19th century is not simply about explicit bodies or explicit sexual desires, but rather about explicit bodies and desires that are either performing some type of social, political, or religious critique, or that are representing a whole range of non-heteronormative or perhaps queer desires that are marked as a little bit, as slightly more illegible than heteronormative desires. And this is what marks them as obscene, as pornographic, all right? So here I want to return very quickly to that bonfire and to the decision of that group of students to march from the Plaza de Santo Domingo into, from the Plaza de Santo Domingo into the Zócalo. The Plaza de Santo Domingo is a sort of physical space that has, since the founding of the Inquisition in 1571, served as the headquarters of the Holy Office of the Inquisition in Mexico. So this is a plaza that is marked symbolically by its historical efforts, or the efforts of the Catholic Church to extirpate heresy and to regulate forms of blasphemy and other attacks on ideas and tenets of the Catholic faith. As you enter the Plaza de Santo Domingo today, or for those anti-pornography protesters who entered the plaza in 1955, they would have seen this slogan or motto of the Inquisition in Latin emblazoned on the building of the Palacio de la Inquisición. And it reads, Exurge Domine et judica causam tuam. Rise up, O Lord, and judge your cause. And what interests me here is both the architectural symbolism of the building itself with this inscription and how the plaza and the physical space and the symbolic space has long been associated with religious orthodoxy and with the punishment of spiritual heterodoxy. As historian Martin Nesvig tells us, it's no coincidence that the seal of the Inquisition, which is seen on the edificio, the Palacio of the Inquisition, was employed as early as Leo X's 1520 bull, papal bull, which also bore the same title, Exurge Domine, written in response to the teachings of Martin Luther that pointed directly to, in the words of Nesvig, quote, the fear of the spreading creeping evils of heresy that lay at the heart of the mechanical logic of the Inquisition. End quote. Thus, the words emblazoned on the Palace of the Inquisition take us to the logical conclusion that, in the words of Martin Nesvig, looking at the colonial period, quote, heretics and their defenders, aiders, and abettors must all be either brought back into the fold of Catholicism or extirpated. So this 1955 burning of pornography in the Zócalo really does, I think, strategically connect to a cross-temporal policing and regulation of unnatural or erotic or pornographic bodies and desires throughout the colonial period. We can think about the ways in which the burning of a massive pile of pornography resonates, for example, with the burnings of bodies such as those of unrepentant heretics in the Plaza de San Diego, just on the western end of the Alameda, just a kilometer or so from the Plaza de Santo Domingo, or from criminal courts burnings of sodomites in the Plaza de San Lázaro, just east of downtown Mexico City, centuries earlier. 1955 anti-pornography protesters imagined pornography as a type of modern-day heresy that needed to be, just as throughout the colonial period, eradicated, annihilated, and destroyed, just like a malignant cancer. And what's so interesting here is that, we could think about, I don't have time to really go into the ways in which the Inquisition itself was very concerned in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries about policing the thoughts and the beliefs of individuals, but actually much less interested in, say, confiscating pornographic objects or pornographic, print or material culture. And instead, individuals in the 17th and 18th centuries who circulated erotica and pornography were by and large punished leniently and lightly by the Inquisition. And this, I think, sort of contrasts markedly from the fervor and the kind of vitriol of the 1955 anti-pornography protesters. And again, these are just sort of local differences and points of connection between the colonial period and the present. Now, I want to really spend the remaining minutes. I know I am going over time, but I will finish in about 5 minutes. To think about how these things connect to some of the grassroots archival and activist projects, aesthetic projects, and art projects in places, throughout Latin America. I'm focusing here on Archivo El Insulto, which has espoused a grassroots archival praxis and queer curatorial display in order to mobilize affect and reimagine new archival, activist, and political potential for vintage pornography and erotica. Here, I sort of posted the mission statement in Spanish and in English from Archivo El Insulto, their website, which is just elinsulto.com. I urge, museum goers to visit this website. It's really a sort of phenomenal entry point to the project. But what I find most provocative about Archivo El Insulto are the sort of queer uses to which the archives put largely heteronormative and mainstream pornography, which are marketed primarily toward men. Archivo El Insulto reactivates and reimagines their own archival praxis and curatorial display in terms of how we might reactivate these objects and images in the present. In 2019, for example, Archivo El Insulto, just prior to the pandemic, staged multiple interactive exhibits in downtown Mexico City at independent art galleries that attracted diverse audiences and stakeholders, in the archives. This included, among others, una colección particular for the Noche de Archivos Abiertos, or our peculiar collection for the Night of Open Archives, and a second exhibit called Se ruega tocar, intimar con las memorias del deseo, or Please Touch, Embracing the Memories of Desire, which was staged at Terremoto. At both events, Archivo El Insulto collaborated with a diverse range of artists, curators, LGBTQ activists, and sex worker activists, including the Alianza Mexicana de Trabajadores Sexuales, or the Mexican Alliance of Female Sex Workers. Archivo El Insulto also collaborated with activists, educators, and members of the general public to both engage physically with the objects, spreading, for instance, a whole range of vintage pornographic books and magazines and photographs among tables and cushions so that, exhibit goers could browse and read and discuss and even flirt over, and I think flirt with, the materials in question. In doing so, I think Archivo El Insulto challenges some of the often vertical power structures that I think orient the relationships between archives, archive users, and archival records, and instead tries to produce a sort of horizontal approach to the archives. So part of our work together, the final sort of thing I'll focus on in this talk, and I promise I'm finishing up here, wrapping up. But part of our work together, I have been collaborating with Archivo El Insulto since 2017 or 2018. And in the 5 or 6 years we have been working together, part of our strategic collaboration has been seeking out in flea markets and bookstores in Mexico City, popular and cheaply produced Latin American pornographic and erotic novelettes published in Spanish between the 1910s and the 1950s. These novels often featured graphic, explicitly pornographic images of a whole range of sexual acts. And these books often, I'll just skip to this. So this is an image of a box known as Caja Daniel, which was purchased from a bookseller in downtown Mexico City, and that presumably belonged to an individual named Daniel, and that somehow made its way into this downtown Mexico City bookstore and was purchased by Adolfo Vega, the founder of Archivo El Insulto, for inclusion into its collections. And this group of about 50 pornographic novelettes assert on the book covers that they have been published in apocryphal places such as Paris, Barcelona, Mexico City, Rome, Tangier, Morocco, Buenos Aires, Havana, and New York. So the dates, the places of publication, all of these things are sort of up in the air. But here, and I conclude my presentation with this and the images that I will show, to get a better sense of the cross-temporal connections and some of the policing of desire and sex in the colonial period to the ways in which moralizing systems get enshrined within the Mexican state's approaches to the regulation of sex and desire in the 19th and 20th centuries, we can turn to some of the images, I think, in the magazine, or excuse me, in these books themselves. Why, for instance, would mid 20th century Catholic anti-pornography activists have been so offended by some of these images? Of course, pornography is bad to the Catholic Church, but it's really the question of satire, humor, and the forms of political, social, and religious critique that would have been read by some of those protesters as being particularly sacrilegious, heretical, and perhaps even blasphemous. We might turn, for example, to one book in Caja Daniel, which is in Archivo de Insultos collections, called Tan Caliente como Papá, or As Hot as Father, which includes 15 chromolithographic pornographic images, the final two of which depict explicitly religious themes. And in these two images, we get a sense of how pornography here is critiquing, if you read the text, critiquing ideas of clerical celibacy, critiquing ideas of same-sex desire among the clergy and among nuns within the Catholic Church, and looking at the ways, really sort of staging a humoristic critique of Catholic morality of the day. And this, I think, is partly why these images in these books were seen as particularly bad. They didn't simply represent sex, but they represented sex in a way that went against sort of some of the foundational fictions and myths of the family, right? We can go back to the slogans and rallying cries of those 1955 anti-porn activists. The family demands respect, right? And that pornography is destroying the institution of the church and the family and gender roles. I really want to kind of conclude with these crucial points of connection, which I think connect the colonial period to the exhibit being staged at ISLAA, Eros Rising. Historian Lynn Hunt tells us that in the early modern period, pornography was linked to free thinking and heresy, to science and natural philosophy, and to attacks on absolutist political authority. End quote. And I think we see so many of these themes carrying through to pornography as it's produced and circulated and disseminated in the 19th and the 20th centuries. And here I'll just sort of conclude this talk that has gone on longer than it should with a sample of some of the other images from this box, Caja Daniel. We see, for example, and again, I see some fascinating points of connection between the art being displayed at Eros Rising by the phenomenal artists that have been invited to this exhibit, and some of the fascinating artistic and deeply aesthetic pornographic imagery included in some of these novels and novelettes. But we have, a whole range of desires, same-sex desires among women, ideas or representations of historical voyeurism, these sort of beautiful Art Deco-ish and I think just rendered in such, I think, wonderful detail, acts of heteronormative and non-heteronormative sex, but sex and desire that expand materially, corporeally, and discursively the realm of desire, historically and bodily. We can turn to, this is one image that I just absolutely love for its artistic value. And the fact that in this sort of orgy scene, and the fact that the page itself is wet and marred by water stains over the decades. But you have, I'll just leave it to the video viewers to interpret this image for themselves. But you have, a sort of chain of a sexual orgy, and then a scene of presumably a woman using a strap on another woman. You get a whole range of representation of artificial, dildos, artificial phalluses, etc., being introduced into the bodies of women, the bodies of men, and the bodies of a whole range of other historical subjects. And finally, bringing us back again, I think, to the colonial period and the ways in which the sins against nature were policed and prosecuted and criminalized largely because of the ways they challenged a sort of divinely ordained sense of male-female orderly procreation. And again, we see these popping up again and again and again in print culture and pornography and erotica and art throughout the 20th century, leading us up into the present. So these are 3 images taken from 3 different books in Caja Daniel that represent scenes of male homoeroticism, bestiality, and fisting. And again, these images, they're playful, they're satirical, they're aesthetically, I think, beautiful and really deeply analytically compelling. So finally, I just want to end with this. In thinking about the aesthetic traces of bodies and desires across time, whose erotic imaginaries do pornographic visual and print records reflect? And how do these imaginaries inspire and propel different strategies around collecting, confiscating, displaying, and even destroying works of art and other historical records? What does it mean to think about the life uses of erotic objects and images as they intersect with museums, archives, and libraries and their own systems of capture, legal constructions of evidence, and even affective connections? When sexually explicit records are set in motion by owners, by conservative students in the 1950s, by inquisitors in the 1800s or in the 1700s, and even by grassroots community-based archivists in the present, how can they instate new erotic imaginaries, some of which are sexualized, but many of which can also be read as satirical, humoristic, activist, perhaps even queer and offensive? And with this, I conclude. Feminist media studies scholar Susanna Passonen notes, and I'll just bring us back to this image here and its sort of material markings of wetness. But Susanna Passonen writes that regarding 20th century print pornography, quote, "Memories are impossible to decouple from the feel of the glossy pages, slightly moist and sticky from their exposure to the natural elements, from the smell of ink and paper, and from the sounds made when the pages were turned. In these memories, texture, sensation, fascination, and pictorial content stick firmly together and give rise to a particular sense of materiality." End quote. And it's really, I hope that what this talk did was bring us in a cross-temporal sense to thinking about these senses of materiality and corporeality and the aesthetic as they intersect with the erotic, the obscene, and the pornographic. These interwoven textures of materiality, memory, and embodied encounters with the erotic lead us into new and exciting territory around the aesthetics and the politics of the historical and the artistic representations of non-heteronormative desires and queer desires across time, leading us up into the present. And it's really here that I see today's ISLAA exhibition, Eros Rising, Visions of the Erotic in Latin American Art, as part of a much larger historical genealogy of the erotic, the obscene, and the pornographic in Latin America, which leads us from the colonial present to from the colonial period to the present. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing the exhibits and yes.